to show you how to work a chain when you are just starting off at the beginning of your crochet project. So the first thing that you're going to do before you even start working on the crochet chain is you are going to tie a slip knot. There are a million different ways to do this. If you already are comfortable doing it one way, however you've worked a slip knot in the past is going to be fine. But my preference is to take my yarn, lay it in a little loop this way, give it half a turn, so at this point I think it looks like a fish. Reach through the fish's head, grab one of the tails, leave the long ends of the tails on the outside, and just pull. And so you're going for a loop that changes size. If your loop changes size, you know you did it right. So if I pull on one of the tails, my loop gets smaller. So you know that you did it the right way if that happens. And we are going to put that slip knot on our crochet hook and pull the tails. Pull one tail. One tail will make it smaller and one tail won't do anything. So if one doesn't work, use the other one. Until that kind of touches the shaft of our crochet hook all the way around, but we don't want to pull it super, super tight. So we're going to want a little bit of wiggle room in there. And then making sure that you are not using the short tail end. You're using the longer end. You do want to leave that tail 4, 5, 6 inches long. Don't make it super short. It'll just be more challenging to weave in at the end. So make sure you're not using your tail. Make sure you're using the end that's connected to your ball of yarn. You are going to take that end of yarn, you're going to lay it across your crochet hook, and you do want to go the direction that I just went. So you want to go across in that direction. And then we're going to pull the strand of yarn that I just laid across, pull it through the loop that's already on your hook. Pull it through the loop. And that is a crochet chain. So we take our working yarn, we lay it across our crochet hook, and we pull that strand of yarn through the loop. You will notice that for me, and in my experience, holding your crochet hook in your right hand, this is assuming that you are a right-handed crocheter like I am, holding your crochet hook in your right hand and having your right hand's only job be to move the hook, and having your left hand do the job of moving the working yarn and holding everything still, so that your right hand's only job is to move that strand of yarn through, is probably going to feel a little bit more comfortable for you. If you are holding your fabric in your right hand and you're trying to hold your hook in your right hand, it's very difficult to pull that strand through because your fabric is coming with you. And the same thing if you leave your fabric hanging down and you're trying to manipulate it and pull things through, it doesn't allow you to do that very easily. So my left hand holds my working yarn and my fabric still, so that my right hand's only job is to pull that strand through. Once you've done your crochet chain, you're going to do however many chains your pattern is telling you to. Then it's going to be time to begin working in the chain. This chain is a little bit harder to see exactly what you're doing because this particular pattern is having you use a crochet hook that is much larger than you would normally use for this small a yarn, but we can still work with that. So the pattern for this cropped loose weave sweater, and I will put a link to the pattern in the comments here so that you can find that pattern. The pattern is going to tell you to skip the first 3 chains. So we are going to skip the first 3 chains, 1, 2, 3, and then do a double crochet in each chain across. So when I put my hook in to my fabric, I like to insert my hook under 2 strands. So you'll notice there's kind of 3 strands in the crochet chain. I like to put my hook under 2 of those strands. So there's 2 strings on top and 1 string underneath. And then lay my yarn across and work my stitch through there. And so when I go into the next one, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put my hook under 2 strands of yarn. And sometimes that can be a little bit tricky. Working into the chain can always be a little bit more challenging than working the rest of your fabric. So I've inserted my hook under 2 strands of that chain, lay my yarn across, and go ahead and work the stitch, whatever stitch the pattern is telling you to do. And that's how you work a chain, and then how you begin working into that chain on your way back. I'm going to be showing you right now how to do a very basic stitch and crochet, the double crochet. The particular piece that this pattern is using is actually using a much larger hook than you would normally use for the lace weight yarn, and this is what's giving us such an open fabric. So if you're looking at the fabric thinking that doesn't look like a double crochet, you're right, it's just done at a much looser gauge than you would generally do, and that's for the effect that I wanted in the piece. But in case you are a newer crocheter and you have not ever done a double crochet before, this is how to work that very basic stitch. The first step that you are going to do is you are going to take your working yarn and you are going to wrap it around your hook. And you're not going all the way around, you're more laying it across your hook. And then you are going to insert your hook into the next stitch where you're ready to go. So you have the original loop around your hook, you have the wrap that you did, and then you have the stitch that you inserted your hook into. You're now going to lay the yarn across your hook and pull it under the fabric where you inserted your hook as step one. You're going to lay your yarn across a second time. You're going to go under the next 2 strands of yarn on your hook, under those 2. That's step 2. And then you're going to wrap your yarn around a third time and go under these last 2 strings. So one more time a bit faster. We put the yarn over our hook. We insert the hook into our fabric in the stitch that it's meant to go in. Yarn goes around the hook. We come under 2 strings. Yarn goes around under 2 strings. Yarn goes around under 2 strings. As I put my hook into my fabric, you'll notice as I put my hook in, the 2 strings next to each other here smush together and they kind of look like there's only 1 strand there, but there actually are 2 strings where I've inserted my hook. So I come under the 2 strings where I put my hook, and come under the next 2 strings and the last 2 strings. And that is how you work a very basic double crochet. This is probably the most commonly used stitch in crochet because it creates fabric faster and a little bit less dense than a single crochet. So a single crochet stitch is probably the most basic stitch in crochet, but you're truly not going to use a single crochet quite as often as a double crochet because a single crochet creates such a dense fabric and uses so much yarn. If you make an entire scarf with a single crochet, your scarf is just going to be a lot heavier and take a lot longer to do than a lot of people like. The only other tricky step about a double crochet happens when you get to the end of a row, and so that's what I'm doing. I kind of wanted you guys to see how when you get your flow down with your double crochet, how that looks when you've been double crocheting and are very comfortable with it. And then right when you're at the end, so I'm going along, every stitch where I put my hook seems very obvious. It's always in the same spot. It's always under the 2 strands. Everything looks exactly the same as every stitch that came before until you get to the very end of your row. So I did the last stitch in the exact same spot where all of my other stitches made sense. I've run out of spaces that look exactly like all of the other ones. It is very tempted now to think that you're done, especially because I can kind of pull my fabric on the edge and make it look like it's in a straight line. But when you get to this point, when you've gone through the last hole that looks exactly like all of the other spots along, you have 1 additional place to put your hook, always. My rule is always, if the last stitch felt easy to do, and just like all of the other ones, I know I'm not done yet. You are always going to do your last double crochet on top of a row of double crochets. You're always going to do that last stitch right here in the spot that's a little bit harder to get into. It's actually the chain 3 that you did in the previous row. So you get all the way to the end going in the exact same way every stitch, and then you know you always have this last stitch to do. You're going to work that double crochet exactly the same as all of the other ones, wrap your yarn around, but when I go to put it in, it's going to be a little bit trickier to find. You always want to see if you can get under 2 strings right there on that edge. And then we're going to work the double crochet identically to how we've worked all of the other double crochets. And now I truly am at the edge and I'm going to have a nice straight edge there. And then when we're ready to start the next row of double crochet, we're going to be working back. So we always work crochet, assuming you are right-handed like I am. You're always going to work crochet from your right-hand side towards the left, so the opposite direction that you would read. And when we are beginning a row, we're going to do what's called a turning chain. We work that exactly like any other crochet chain. We wrap the yarn around our hook and we pull it through. We're going to do 3 crochet chains for a double crochet. That was 1. This is 2. This is 3. And now I'm going to get ready to go ahead and do my double crochets exactly the same, but you want to skip this very first one. So you're never putting your crochet hook into the turning chain, never ever. I don't care how many turning chains you do, you're never putting your crochet hook in any of them. So we know we are skipping the first 3, the turning chains that we just did, and with the double crochet we're also going to skip that very first stitch. So I'm actually going to be putting my crochet hook right there. And I'm ready to start with my next double crochet. Put my crochet hook right in there, and now I'm working double crochets all the way across to the other end, exactly like I showed you before. And that's how you do a double crochet and how you work an edge. I am going to show you now how we create the T shape of the t-shirt style top that we're doing now. So when you're creating the piece of fabric that you're using to make this really open top, like to wear over a tank or a dress, you are going to begin at the top along the long edge of this T shape, like a capital T. You're going to work back and forth to make the width of the sleeve that you like. And then we are going to be sort of binding off. That's what it would be called if this was a knitted piece. But we're going to be sort of inching our fabric over so that we create the bottom leg of this T, and we get this nice crisp line here. We do also want to make sure that that happens in the same place on the same row for the right sleeve and the left sleeve. So we want to make sure that this happens on the same row. We don't want to end early, sort of turn around before you get to the end on one row and then do the same thing on the next row, because that actually makes our sleeves 2 different widths. The sleeve that the first row that you did that on, that sleeve would be narrower and the sleeve on the other side would be wider. It's not going to be a horrible thing if you do that because the rows themselves are fairly narrow, but to me it was a big enough deal that I wanted to make sure that I had a different option to make sure that our sleeves were the same width as each other. So to create that, what we're going to do, and I will put a link in the comments to the pattern, so you've got the full pattern written out. When you get to that point where you have created sleeve fabric, the width that you are supposed to, or the width that you prefer, you are going to be ready to begin the next row. And the pattern is going to tell you to work 1 slipped stitch into each of the first 8 stitches. And that slipped stitch isn't going to add any height, it's just going to allow us to take our working yarn and kind of inch it across to get to where we're ready to start the next part of our fabric. So to work a slipped stitch, if you haven't done that before, we do not need to do any kind of a turning chain because we're not adding any fabric, so we don't need any of the height of a turning chain. We are simply going to insert our hook under the 2 strands of the first stitch of that row. We're going to wrap our yarn around our hook, and we're going to pull the yarn we wrapped around our hook through every loop on our hook. So we're going under the 2 strands of fabric from the stitch where we inserted it, and under the loop that was on our hook. So we're back to 1 loop on our hook. And we're simply going to do that in the first 8 stitches across. So we've done the first one, here's the second one, here's the third one, and it does feel a little tricky if you've not done a slipped stitch before, because it is so tempting to wrap your yarn around that second time like you're going to do a single crochet or a double crochet. But you don't want to do that. You want to go in and then pull the yarn through every loop on your hook so that we're not adding any fabric. So once you've worked across the number of stitches that the pattern's telling you to, this pattern is telling us to go across 8 stitches, then it is going to be time to begin our next row of double crochets. And our yarn is connected to our stitch from the row below right here. We're just going to begin our turning chain and go right from this point. So I'm going to go ahead and chain my 3, and we're going to begin working our double crochets exactly like normal right here. So we're going to just put our double crochet into that next stitch. And that creates that smooth transition to create that T shape of the garment that you're doing. So this is what you do at the beginning of that row, where you are taking off the little bit of sleeve stitches. When you're getting to the end of this row, so you're going to double crochet all the way across, and the pattern is going to tell you to double crochet 1 stitch in each stitch until you are 8 stitches from the end. And then you are going to stop your row there, and you're going to be working back and forth on that smaller number of stitches to create the body of the garment that you're doing. We don't have to do this where we're slip stitching across. On the other end, we can just stop short, and that gives us the same number of rows for the sleeve stitches. So we have the same number of rows on the sleeve stitch that we have on both sides, versus if we stop short on this side and stop short on the other side, one of our sleeves would be 1 row wider than the other one, and that bugged my brain, so I wanted a different way to do it. Today I'm going to be showing you how to work a seam in the crocheted piece for this sweater that we are doing. So the fabric on this is a very open, so it's a very sort of flowy casual top, and that can make seaming a little bit more challenging. So I wanted to make sure we really talked about how to get this nice clean looking seam, and it looks, in my opinion, it looks nice from either direction. This was the side that I actually worked the seam on. Creates a little bit more visual seam. Versus this is the traditionally thought of as the right side. This is the side that the seam was not worked on. So you get to pick which of those you like the look of. But we are going to be sewing the seam on the other side. So I'm going to recommend that you lay your piece out flat with the 2 pieces on top of each other. The front and the back are identical in this particular pattern, and so you are just going to be laying those right on top of each other this way. And kind of pull and tug things so that everything fits nicely together. This fabric is very stretchy, and so you are going to want to make sure that you're not letting one piece sort of stretch more than the other. So the top and the bottom all work up and meet up nicely. And now you are simply going to take the rest of your working yarn, so you'll have some left over after you've finished crocheting the front and the back pieces of this. You are going to take some of that spare yarn. You are going to go ahead and tie a slip knot just like you would at the beginning of the piece. And you are going to insert your crochet hook. Let me move the rest of the body of that piece out of the way. Insert your crochet hook, find the corner pieces, and you're going to see the little, kind of the little space where you're right at the edge in the corner, that square at the corner of your piece. You are going to put those squares over the top of each other, the front and the back pieces together, and you're going to put your hook under both of that. And then you're going to slide that slip knot that you tied over your hook and tighten that up. And now we're just going to pull that slip knot through the fabric on our hook and work 1 chain, and that kind of ties everything together. And now we're going to, again, you've got the 2 pieces of fabric laying on top of each other. We're just going to be finding those matching holes through both pieces. So I'm going to insert my hook through the next space between the 2 double crochets on the pieces. I'm going to wrap my yarn around and pull it under that fabric, wrap my yarn around, and go under the next 2 pieces of fabric. So I'm just doing a basic single crochet. We do want to make sure that we are not pulling too tight. We make things nice and loose. We don't want our seams to sort of pucker and be tighter than the rest of our fabric. And we're just going to keep doing that. We're going to put our hook through the holes on both pieces and go through the holes on both pieces and go through. you are going to do that across the underside of our sleeve. So that's where we're working right now, is the underside of our sleeve. And you'll notice that things change. This is a T-shaped top, and so you've got the underside of the sleeve, and then we're going to make a right angle and come down the bottom here. And we are just going to keep working the same way. You're going to have the directionality of your stitches is going to change when you hit that 90-degree turn, but we're going to keep doing the same thing where the two pieces set right on top of each other, and we're just matching up the same holes so that our hook goes through the fabric of both of them at exactly the same spot. So this is where that T turns. You've got your 90-degree turn right here, and so now we're working down the side of our piece. We just line everything up, and we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to go under those two holes. And now that we're working down this side, you'll see the longer cross pieces here, and then you'll see the shorter spot. We are going to put our hook in and do our single crochet in that spot as well. So you're kind of doing 2 stitches for each double crochet that you're working along the long edge of. And that's because a double crochet is taller than a single crochet is wide. And so we're kind of doing 2 single crochets for each one of those all the way down. So you'll put one here, and then you'll put one here, and then you'll put one here, and then you'll put one here, all the way down. As long as they're fairly evenly spaced, everything is going to work out exactly the way that you want it to. And that's how we're going to do the seaming down that T-shaped side, and also along the top, like the top of the letter T. This is going to be where the neck hole is. We're going to do that same seaming technique from the outside of the sleeve into the neck edge as well. I'm going to show you now how to work the scalloped edge or the shell stitch that I have listed as an optional add-on to this pattern, this loose open autumn shorty pattern, and I will put a link to the full pattern in the comment section so you can find the paper pattern as well if you'd like it. So this is worked as a very simple shell. It is 7 treble crochets worked all into the exact same stitch, and then a slipped stitch worked here on the edge, and then you do go ahead and work 7 treble crochets into the next stitch, and then a slip stitch, and you just repeat that all the way around. I do recommend in the pattern that you begin by doing a slip stitch in the kind of the armpit seam and working your first few. That way, if it takes 1 or 2 to get some practice done, this isn't an area that is going to be super visible. And if when you're ending, they don't match up perfectly, it's going to be right there in that armpit, and it's not going to be real visible as well. So that's why I would recommend that you go ahead and start, although the join where you start and finish is pretty seamless at the end. So I'm going to show you how to actually work that stitch, and I'm going to be showing you how to work the stitch on the bottom of this piece. So it's a T shape. So you've got the neckline up at the top. Your sleeve is where I'm giving you the option. That's where I chose to do mine. But you also have the option to put that little shell along the bottom too if you wanted to. I personally chose not to, and I'm just going to do this for demonstration purposes, mostly because that is an area of my body that I don't necessarily want to draw attention to, and so I've chosen not to add that little sort of visual interest right there to draw the eye around the waist. Although you certainly could do it, and you may find that it is a very flattering place for the sweater to hit you if you make it just that little bit longer. It's up to you, just the look of the sweater that you are going to be the most comfortable wearing. But to actually work the piece, what you're going to do is you're going to begin at one of the seams. You are going to tie a slip knot with your yarn. You are going to insert your hook into the place where you want to begin, and I actually, in the seam, I prefer to take my hook and go through the stitches on both sides of that seam. If you go right through the seam line, you're putting some extra stress and making that seam sort of stretch apart a little bit more. And so I prefer to go one on either side of that seam. And then I put the loop around my hook and I pull through that way. And that has gone ahead and attached my yarn, and I'm going to do just a single chain one to really secure that on there. And now I'm going to begin working my 7 treble crochets into the same spot. And for this pattern, you are going to skip 1 full stitch and put your hook into the second stitch, because you want that length for your treble crochet to stretch out. So we are going to put the yarn around our crochet hook 2 times. We are going to insert our crochet hook into our fabric. In order for the shell to look nice, it's a little bit trickier with the loose gauge that you have here, because if you were to work your 7 treble crochets just into this space, which is where you would normally put your hook to work a stitch, the hole is so big, it's not going to keep the center of your shell looking nice and neat and tidy. Let me grab the shell piece again. So in order to really get this nice look to your shell, you want that center stitch to be pretty firm. You don't want it to stretch out and be really big, or your shell just starts to look sloppy. So when we're putting our hook in, we need to find a stitch that's not going to be real gape open for you. So when we're looking to put our hook in with this loose a gauge, I know I'm aiming for this general neighborhood is where I want, but I'm actually going to kind of pull and tug things apart a little bit, and I'm actually going to insert my hook into a little bit of a different spot. I'm just looking for someplace in my stitches that is going to give me a nice, neat, and tidy shell stitch, kind of in the neighborhood of where I'm going. So I put my hook right in there, and I'm going to work my treble crochet. So I wrap my yarn around my hook 1 time, I pull under the 2 strands of fabric where I inserted my hook, put my yarn across, I come under 2 more strings, put my yarn across, come under 2 more strings, and finally put my yarn across and come under the last 2 strings. So that is a treble crochet. And when I am going to work 6 more treble crochets, and I'm going to put my hook into that exact same spot where I went for my first time. So it doesn't even matter all that much where you pick to put your hook for the first treble crochet, as long as you do all 7 in the exact same spot. So again, I wrap my yarn around my hook 2 times. I put my hook in the exact same spot. And you're basically going under 2 strands until you run out of strands of yarn. And I'm doing my 3rd treble crochet, so I wrap my yarn around my hook 2 times. I put it in that exact same hole, and I'm going to work another treble crochet. And so for this particular shell, the pattern is telling you to do 7. Generally with shell stitches, you are going to do an odd number. And honestly, this can be a choose your own adventure kind of shell. You can try 5 shells or 5 treble crochets and see if you like the look of that. You can try 9 treble crochets and see if you like the look of that. The fewer number of treble crochets that you put, so if you were to choose to do 5 instead of 7, your shell would be a little bit more subtle. That scalloped edge would be a little bit less pronounced than in my sample one. And if you chose to put 9 in there, you would get exactly the opposite. Your scalloped edges would be a little bit more pronounced and look a little bit more aggressive. And I can't count and talk at the same time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I've got my 7 treble crochets, and I put them all in the exact same spot. And now I'm going to work a slipped stitch. And again, I'm going to skip 1, 2, and I'm going to put my hook right around here. The slipped stitch doesn't matter quite as much if you get it in a really tight part of your stitch, because you're not relying on that stitch maintaining its kind of tight, small size when you're working the rest of them in. But I just did that without telling you what I was doing. So again, you finish your 7 treble crochets in the same stitch, you skip 2 stitches, you slip stitch, so we are not wrapping our yarn around our hook, we are just inserting the hook straight into our fabric. We are laying the yarn across one time, and we are going to pull that yarn through every loop on our hook. So under the fabric that we inserted our hook through, and under the strand that was already around our hook. And that is our slip stitch. And now we're ready to work straight into the next shell. So you're doing treble crochets again, double wrap, again, skip 2 stitches, and pull and tug just a little bit until you find a spot that looks like it's going to be a nice tight stitch so that your shell is going to have a nice tight look to it. And that is how you work the shell edging on this pattern.